Welcome back to the Pastor Study. And we're back in the Pastor Study. That's a clue that we are not going to give you a Bible assignment later on today. Because we don't have all of our verses and colored pencils and whatnot in front of us. Today is going to be, on one hand, easier, but on the other hand, more difficult. Because we're going to be talking about historical context of the Bible and also what we bring to the text when we go and read a passage of Scripture.
Yeah, definitely. So when we say historical context of the Bible, that should not make a uniform picture in your mind. There were a lot of different historical contexts to the various events in the Bible. Just like now, history changes. And so when you're reading a passage, it's very important to know what is going on around that passage. Last week, I broke down a passage from Nehemiah in which he describes how he approaches the king of Persia to get permission to build up his home city, Jerusalem. That passage doesn't make sense unless you understand that Nehemiah's people had been conquered by the Babylonians, and then the Babylonians had been conquered by the Persians. Well, if you understand what it means to be a cupbearer in a king's court, it was a position of high authority. He's not just the guy who brings in the wine. He's the guy who makes sure the king doesn't get poisoned at all. That's an important place. You also have to understand why walls are so important to a city, because Nehemiah makes a big deal about walls. We don't have walled cities today. Why does Jerusalem need walls? These are all historical elements that help us understand Nehemiah's grief, his desperation, his decision to go do something, and his prayer before God. Understanding what's going on culturally, geographically around Nehemiah gives us the meaning of the passage, the depth of the passage.
Well, it helps us understand it.
Yeah.
So understanding the history and the historical context is important. And there are plenty of awesome resources out there. Just about any Bible encyclopedia or dictionary, almanac, commentaries on individual books of the Bible, all of them should be talking about historical context. History books on first century Palestine or life in the Persian Empire.
Absolutely.
These are all resources that are available to anyone right there on Amazon.
In addition to that, there are a lot of really great websites out there. You all know that you need to be careful about your sources online, but a lot of churches, the Catholic Church, Episcopal Church, have a lot of information on New Testament characters. And universities often have websites that will be devoted to historical times and places. Those are all great sources to use for background information too.
And while I would never recommend Wikipedia if you were writing a sermon or researching a paper, it is an awesome quick reference just to get you an idea. And what I like about Wikipedia is that there's usually a list of sources at the bottom that will help you take the next step of further learning about whatever topic that you're. My wife's a teacher. Every time the word Wikipedia gets mentioned, she dies a little bit. So
no, I just say, look at the sources.
Look at the sources.
Look at the sources.
And that segues into our next phase of today's talk is look at your sources. One, be aware of the cultural perspective and biases of your sources.
Yes.
And be aware of what you bring to the table. What are your cultural assumptions and biases? Now, I'm not using biases as a bad word right now. It's just everything, just using a context of machines. You go out and a sports car is going to be biased to want a certain type of high performance gasoline in order to function properly. That's going to be a completely different kind of fuel that, say, your old diesel truck would want. Not saying that one is better or worse or good or bad, but you have to understand what's going into the machine to make it work. And so this is going to be a very simplified discussion on how we can look at other cultures and look at ourselves as well. So, for example, sociologists have certain continuums that they use to describe a culture. Here are the four that I find most useful for us in our discussion, especially when we're talking about the Bible. On one hand of the spectrum, we have cultures that are more concerned about guilt and guilt and innocence. That would be like our culture.
Right.
Did you do something wrong? Well, if you did, you're guilty. If you didn't do anything legally wrong, then you're innocent. On the other hand, we have guilt and shame cultures. So you might have broken the law over here, but you did so in a way to take care of your community. Therefore, even though you're guilty, you're not really worried about it because you brought honor to your family.
Mm.
Whereas maybe you didn't break the law, but you did something that brought shame on your family. Now you're going to feel bad about that. So when we read the read the Bible, we're usually talking about a honor-shame culture, whereas we tend to be more of a guilt and innocent culture. Again, we still feel shame,
yes,
and they still care about guilt and innocence. But what is the first thing you're going to think about?
What is most important in the minds of people around you?
Not necessarily most important, but what's the first thing that's going to come to your first priority?
All right.
And then we tend to be more you've probably heard this talked about how we're an individualistic society. That's true. Usually it's said as if it was somehow bad, but it's not necessarily bad, it's just the way we are. Every culture is a group of individuals that are part of a community. Every culture is a community that's composed of individuals. Now, those two sentences might sound alike, but notice how I swapped which word came first in those sentences. Mm-hmm. So obviously, we, even though we're an individualistic society, we still care about our community. And a community that's more focused on the communal relationships still care about individuals.
Another way to look at this one I see by your notes is task and relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Today, you walk up to someone, you say, "Who are you?" They might say, "I'm a banker. I'm a farmer. This is my task, my job, what I do in society." In other cultures, you walk up to someone and say, "Who are you?" And they'll say, "I'm the grandson of this person and the nephew of that person and the brother of these three guys."
Yeah.
Because it's the relationships that give them their place in society. Now, that guy with the grandfather and the uncle and the brothers still has a job that he does. And the farmer still has a family that he relates to. But how they identify themselves is pertinent to either their task or their connections.
And if you're part of a Reformed church, there's a good chance that you play Dutch bingo whenever a visitor comes to your church. You'd start talking about, "Oh, who are you related to?" And like, "Oh yeah, that's my cousin is your second cousin." Like, yeah, we have a family relationship. So even though we're individuals, we still have the same concerns as anybody around the world does. Next on the list, and this is a little bit harder to grasp and understand, is low power and high power. Or I should say the distance between the low and the high power people in a society. We tend to be our powers tends to be more dispersed, more egalitarian. Our lowest is actually not, as far as a society, I'm tripping over my tongue today.
I think I know what you're saying.
Even in our society, the lowest of the low has just as many rights as the highest of the high in our society. Ideally. Now, with that being said, obviously, the President of the United States has a lot more power. He can do a lot more things, but in a court of law, he doesn't have any more legal rights as a citizen of the United States as any one of us, or even the homeless beggar on the streets of Sioux Falls.
So, in this case, our rights limit his power.
Right.
And it's not a position, high power positions could be filled by a number of different people.
Yes.
We could run for president if we had the
We
mind.
could run for president. As long as we fulfilled the constitutional requirements, there's nothing preventing any citizen of the United States from running for office. So that tends to be our society is usually labeled as egalitarian or dispersed. We have a low power distance.
Okay.
Contrast that with other societies that are labeled as a hierarchy or a monarchy. Caste systems, they have a high power distance. Now, in our cultures, we tend to look down on those cultures.
Yeah.
Because freedom and civil rights and
There's been a lot of abuses in those kind of cultures.
but if we're honest, there's plenty of abuses in our own culture.
Always.
Now, the thing about what's good about those high power, or the distance, is that each rung of society has certain expectations and rules that they have to follow.
Right.
So even though a king might have more rights as the peasant, the king, in theory, has more responsibilities. And so what often happens, not always, but what often happens is that these societies also tend to be more communal and more of an honor-shame culture, which means that what can happen is that a widow might go before a king and present a complaint to him. Well, because she's so far down the power scale that she's able to shame the king into doing what is right. And this even happens today in a lot of Middle Eastern countries where somebody important is going down the street, and then you got this poor woman who kind of throws herself before his feet, asking for mercy for her son or something, and it puts
pressure
because it's out in the open, putting a kind of a, you better grant my request or you're going to be shamed, oh high and mighty ruler, which would never happen in our society. You go throw yourself before the president, there's going to be, security, of course, but you can say, oh, I'm sorry, but my hands are tied. We have Congress and the courts and blah, 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 and all these other, the power has been dispersed, so there's no shame that can be put onto the president to do something on a widow's behalf.
Doesn't stop the media from trying.
No, again, we still have shame in our culture. They still have innocence in theirs, but it's just how things are set up and what are the correct ways of working in that culture,
right?
As well as what are the kind of shrewd ways of working at the culture.
Gotcha.
And that kind of, and it comes to our final continuum that we're looking at is how do we communicate? Direct communication or indirect communication? Now we tend to be more on the direct side of things. Most Northern European countries are even more direct than the United States. Whereas indirect might be more, say, Latin America or Africa or Asian cultures. Prime example is how much permission does a person have to use the word no? Usually in the honor shame cultures, saying no is like you would almost never say no. It would cast shame on yourself and on them. And so you have to come up with indirect ways of making requests and for saying no to various things. Whereas in our culture, if I wanted to borrow a hammer from my neighbor, I just say, hey neighbor, can I borrow your hammer? And if he didn't want to let me have his hammer, he could just say no. And in our culture, not a big deal. We just move on.
A touch abrupt. But
a
not
touch
bad.
abrupt. Now, in say, Germany, it would be that abrupt. Here, I might say something like, hey neighbor, can I borrow your hammer? And he says, no, I'm using it for a project.
Right.
Usually there has to be some sort of reason for why the request is being denied. So it's not completely direct, but it's still fairly direct. Contrast that with, say, the country of Jordan. You would never ask your neighbor directly, may I borrow your hammer? That would be too direct. Likewise, your neighbor would never say, no, you can't borrow my hammer. A person might come up and say, I have this project, I got all my parts together, but I'm just looking for a hammer. and then I can begin the project and it'll be done, it'll be great. And the neighbor would be like, oh, you know, I have a hammer. If you come by tomorrow, you can borrow it. And this is an example. Now, what happened is you just asked your neighbor to borrow a hammer, and your neighbor has just politely said no, because you need the hammer today, and they're saying come by tomorrow. And so, even though the communication is all over the place and might be confusing, because they're in that culture, they understand what they're saying. Nobody is insulted, nobody has lost honor, nobody has gathered shame because of that.
There's a lot of room for misunderstanding between those four continuums. Between honor and shame, guilt and innocence, between what's important or what's primary,
Yeah.
the individual or the community, where the power lies, and how you communicate that.
Yep. Yeah. Potential for miscommunications is all over the place. What I just presented to you was actually based upon a study that IBM did back in the 60s and 70s.
Wow.
They're an international company with employees from all over the world, and the company realized, you know, for some reason, when we work as our little teams in an individual country, we're fine, but when we start getting together internationally,
we have problems.
Oh, so
no.
they commissioned a study, and the person actually sat down, looked at all the different countries and their different ways of communicating and approaching problems, and so that's kind of the basis where
these four
what I just presented. Yeah, and again, this is a scale. Yeah, on that scale, a society might be at a 6, another one might be at a 5. So I mean, they're very close together. And let's also remember that as individuals, we also slide up and down the scale.
True.
So even though we might be part of a society that was very task-oriented, very focused on individuals, we as a person might be more relationship-focused. We might be more of a communal person, even though we're in a society that focuses on individuals.
Okay.
So something to be aware of. Think about yourself, think about your culture, and just kind of the assumptions you make when you talk with somebody. And the final assumption that gets overlooked a lot, especially by me, is technology.
Okay.
So the example I'm going to use is John chapter 4, when Jesus has a talk with a woman at the well.
All right.
The Samaritan woman at the well. Well, I have no idea where my town well is. I know what
Fair point.
I mean, going to the well doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't have any cultural significance for me. Whereas in the Middle Eastern world, it has a lot of significance. The well is the source, in many ways, the source of life for that village. No well, no village. It's that simple. You need a well because you need water.
So the very fact that we have an underground water infrastructure means it's going to be a little bit harder for us to understand what's going on in a biblical passage.
Yes. Modern technology. Travel. Get in a car, go to Sioux Falls. I could do that in an hour. But Sioux Falls is like 70 miles away. That would be an all-day journey.
2 or 3 days if you're going on foot.
Yeah.
I think the pioneers on the Oregon Trail did 25 miles a day if they were really trucking.
So maybe 100 years ago, not a big deal. You get on the train. You get on the morning train. You do your business in Sioux Falls that day. You get on the train and come home. Anyway, so just kind of be aware of how our technology with cars and cell phones and air conditioning, just how that changes how we interact with our environment. All right. So the technology isn't a big one, but it's something we should talk about. But let's get back to the Samaritan woman at the well.
All right.
We are in a society that tends to focus more on guilt and innocence. We are more individual and task focused. There's a low power difference between the high and the low. And we're more direct in our communication. So with that in mind, when we think about how chapter 4 is usually interpreted, it's almost always interpreted as Jesus confronting the woman as an individual about her guilt and sin, and how he's there to forgive her sins.
Okay.
And Jesus is being direct, or at least we think Jesus is being direct in this talk, whereas the woman is trying to, dodge Jesus's questions because she's trying to, hide her sin or protect herself for whatever reason.
All right.
All right, so that's how we approach the story, because that's what it looks like to us. However, if we are dealing with an honor-shame culture that is more community and relationship-based, where there's a big difference between the people in power and the people out of power, and you don't directly communicate, you always are kind of being circumspect,
All right.
well, this is going to change our interpretation. First off, when the woman is being indirect with her answers to Jesus, well, she's being polite, following the social rules of her day. It's actually Jesus who's being a little
pushy
by being so direct with his questions. Because he asked her, "Woman, give me a drink of water." So you could do that if you're a high power position talking with somebody with a low power position, you can get away with that.
Right.
Well, how does the woman respond?
Why would you ask me? You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan.
She's basically saying, no, get it yourself.
Wow. That's gutsy.
It is gutsy. But remember, they're community focused. She sees Jesus as a Jewish man, and all Samaritans know that the Jews are jerks, because the Jews act like they're better than Samaritans. So here's Jesus telling her what to do and being very direct about it. Well, of course she's going to be a little insulted. Look, I'm part of this Samaritan village. We have pride too. You can't boss me around like I'm your slave. So she's standing up not just for her honor, but the honor of her community.
All right, so Jesus comes back at her with, if you knew who I am, you would ask me for water. So was he just looking for an opening then by being rude? It's a question that you have to ask if you're looking at the text this way.
It is a question you have to ask. Is Jesus... So, again, based upon our other tools that we talked about earlier, we can say, why is Jesus being direct? I mean, he definitely gets the conversation started.
Yes, this is true.
But then again, he's like, well, no, if you think I'm being rude for asking you for water, well, if you knew who I was, you think you know who I am, but you don't. And if you did, you would ask me for water. Which, again, doesn't make sense. Jesus doesn't have any water on him. He's asking her for water. So, of course, she's going to respond with, like, what are you talking about, you crazy person? And so we see this dialogue going back and forth, kind of unfolds from if we take a different perspective, we can see that it's not necessarily about sin and guilt as it is about community and shame.
When you talked to me about this passage, one thing you brought up is that just because she has had 5 husbands doesn't mean that she has been a sinful or adulterous woman. There's not necessarily guilt there. There's a lot of shame there.
Right.
They could divorce her for anything, for not liking her cooking. Of course, she could divorce some of them if their job was considered too low. So being a social climber might bring shame on a person.
So we are assuming that there's guilt involved.
Right.
Well, what kind of guilty woman would have 5 husbands?
Right.
Is the question we're asking. And obviously adultery has to be the answer.
At least part of it, yes.
When, in fact, what we should be saying is, how shamed would a woman be if she had 5 husbands?
And then now had no place as a wife.
They could have all died. She might have been divorced or abandoned. She might be living as a slave in a rich person's house. The man she's living with isn't her husband. That's all we know. We assume adultery is involved because we're assuming guilt when we should be assuming some sort of shame.
And we know she's shamed because she's coming to the well at the middle of the day.
Right.
Nobody does that.
Again, we think, well, at the middle of the day, that doesn't make sense. In fact, it actually kind of makes sense for us because middle of the day, we take a break.
Right.
We go to the local diner. Now, how would the story change if Jesus goes to a local diner at 2:30 in the afternoon? Nobody's there because, again, it's 2:30 in the afternoon, everybody's at work. And he sits down and he sees this woman come into the diner. And she's there to eat her lunch. And Jesus starts asking her to come, hey, by the way, I would like a cheeseburger with fries and a side of Coke, please. And she's like, well, no, I don't work here.
That's a very different angle.
It's a very different angle. And so, like, yeah, why would somebody be coming to the diner at 2:30 in the afternoon to have her meal? Well, it's because she doesn't want to be there when the rest of the community is there. Because of her shame. Awkwardness. Anyway, so then there's a whole lot of other dialogue about this is Jacob's well. Like, she's asking Jesus, are you greater than our father Jacob? Like, in a high power different society, I mean, she's basically going straight to the top. There's nobody higher up their hierarchy than their patriarch of long ago. Nobody's going to get better than Jacob. Well, Jesus said, yeah, I'm actually better. And then in her mind, it's like, well, I can only think of one person who could be greater than Jacob, and that would be the Messiah. Again, in direct culture, she can't directly ask him, are you the Messiah? That would be rude. And she's a woman of low power.
And status with shame.
Low power, status, and shame. It would be, I mean, she could directly ask him that, but he just like brush her off. So she has to be clever and wise and ask this indirect question about the Messiah. We're like, well, we know. And it's important she says we know, not I know.
The community.
So even though she has shame, she's still part of her community. She's still making decisions that are best for her community and not necessarily self-related. So she asks, we know about the Messiah who's going to explain everything when we get here. This is a very indirect way of her, in some ways, asking Jesus to teach her the gospel.
I think you're the Messiah. I can't ask you if you're the Messiah, but I can hint that the Messiah will explain this. I am giving you an opportunity to step in and explain.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge.
And that's when Jesus says, oh yeah. Now Jesus invites her to bring in her community. Go get your husband, come back. And then this is where we're like, oh, well, Jesus is now like putting his finger on her sin, when in fact he's putting his finger on her shame, where she has to admit, I'm not married.
I don't have that exalted status of wife.
Yeah. So, I mean, she's, again, minimizing. She's trying to, I mean, she's not just going to lay it all out on the table.
Here's my whole life story. No.
She's just being honest, but indirect. Like, I don't have a husband. And that's when Jesus says, you're correct. You have had 5 husbands, and the man you're with is not your husband. And so he just proves...
You're very correct.
And he just right off the bat proved that he was a prophet, greater than a prophet. And so she runs... So remember, Jesus is inviting her to bring in her community. And so what does she do? She admits that she doesn't have a husband.
Mm-hmm.
But when he says, you're right, you don't, in fact, blah, 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 she runs off to her community and invites everyone to come.
Thought.
Yes.
With the power distance, Jesus being much more powerful than she, when he reveals that he knows her shame,
Mm-hmm.
is he expressing intentionality? He knew she was this shameful person when he asked her for water, and that did not deter him, honored and powerful as he was, from talking to her anyway. With the fact that he knew her shame, communicate his intention in talking to her.
Intentions, but also giving her honor.
Making her the
He is honoring her with his intentions. The king honors his subjects by noticing them, by talking to them. So, yes, Jesus will eventually take away her shame, but in order to prepare her for that, he starts giving her honor.
Because now she's not going to be the woman who's had the 5 husbands, the woman that the evil eye follows. She's going to be the woman that Jesus spoke to first.
And then she runs into town, and again she asks the question, could this be the Messiah? And a lot of, well, Western
thinking.
Theologians look at this question like, what? She should have figured it out by now. What's wrong with this woman? She still isn't there, when in reality she's being clever and wise in her community. Because to her community, she's still that woman, and she's the lowest of the low. She's, well, not quite the lowest of low, but she's very far down the ladder.
Yes.
She can't just run into town and say, the Messiah's there. They're like, that silly woman, she doesn't know what she's talking about. She just wants attention. But if she shows up and says, wow, I just met this man who told me everything about my life. I wonder if he's the Messiah. I just don't know. Well, now this gets people's curiosity up.
They have to engage the question.
As speaking as a man, we love answering questions. All right. Oh, interesting. Yeah,
Let me go confirm that for you, sweetheart.
Go be a man, yeah.
And you do it well.
Okay, thank you. But of course, it's just not men, but the women of the town as well, and any kids running around the street.
The Messiah?
They're like,
I want to go see that!
Whether or not they think it's the Messiah is beside the point, but hey, there's this, somebody's doing something interesting by the well. Let's go see. It's a good way to spend the afternoon and have some entertainment in a dusty little town where nothing happens. At the very least. Well, yeah. I mean, things happen, they're farmers and herders and taking care of plenty of work, but as far as something out of the ordinary.
True. Very true.
And again, they don't have televisions or radios or computers or access to the internet. Books aren't really a thing in these small towns. What are you going to do to entertain yourself? Well, you play little board games or tell stories, or when a stranger walks by, you go and get the word that...
It's true.
I mean, so...
Technology has made a difference.
Yep.
How you communicate helps us understand what's going on there. It helps us understand the power differential. It helps us understand where they stand in relation to their communities. And it also helps us understand what part of her life Jesus is addressing right here. So that gives us a whole different shade on that passage that we didn't have before, a different filter, if you will.
Yep. And so, again, I said at the beginning, no homework assignment, and I'm going to stick with that. But I'm going to challenge you to think about Jesus and Zacchaeus. Think about how that story changes when you don't look at it as from a guilt and innocence point of view, but from an honor-shame point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it from a individual task person to a community relationship point of view. And just see what happens when you start thinking about it.
Yeah.
Think about it differently.
Think about it spatially and communally. And, oh my.
Yep. Who has the power? Who doesn't have the power?
Which kind of power?
Who's in? Who's out? Yep.
Oh, who's surrounded by people and who is all by himself? It's important when we are reading through these passages and thinking about biases that we not shame one group or another. Every culture has advantages over other cultures. But we gotta give historical cultures the benefit of the doubt. It's very, very common now. It's part of the modern mentality to look back and go they did this and we do that. And since we have science, obviously they were very, very foolish. But every culture has adapted to a set of circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So, as we are reading the Bible, or with any historical literature, it's very important to just keep our culture and their culture in mind. As the authors of our book emphasize, we are not trying to become experts in culture. We are not trying to impose our culture.
Mm-hmm.
We are trying to open the Bible wider so that God can speak to us. And so we need to be aware of our own biases, our own expectations out of life, and we need to be aware of other people's biases and expectations out of life when we approach the scriptures.
And again, our biases aren't necessarily bad things.
No.
We might be unleaded, they might be diesel, and another culture might be electric. It doesn't necessarily mean that one is better than the other, they're just different. And to wrap it up, I was presenting earlier two different ways of looking at John chapter 4. One way isn't inherently better than the other. I'm not saying the interpretation that looked at the woman as being shamed as being superior to the one that looked at the woman being guilty.
Right.
Because Jesus does both. Jesus cares about us as individuals, and he cares about the church, which is a community. He takes away our guilt, he takes away our shame. He gives us honor, and he makes us innocent. And so, when you approach the Bible, having more tools helps us understand the depth and the breadth and the height of Jesus' love better and better. Any final points?
It's going to take a bit of research. It's going to take a bit of self-reflection. This isn't something you're going to be able to do every day, but it is well worth your time. Well worth your time.
And I guess my final point is that the more we understand the Bible, the more we understand ourselves. The more we understand ourselves, the more we understand God. And when more we understand God, the more we understand the people around us. Thinking about the Bible in terms of, say, honor and shame versus guilt and culture is going to help us in our daily lives. Teachers in the classroom with kids who have immigrated from around the world. You're going to need to know how they think and communicate and respond to authority different.
Absolutely.
If you're an employer or a manager, same thing with your employees. If you're providing customer service at a bank or a grocery store or at any, say, at the telephone company, what your expectations from your customer and the expectations your customer has for you are going to shift based upon where they're from. And even different parts of the United States have different expectations. The South is different from the Northwest. The Northeast is different than the Midwest. So,
very true.
The more we're aware of our expectations helps us understand other people's expectations and allows us to be wise and clever in a good sense, wise and loving, and be able to provide for them what they need. I think this is what Paul means when he says, I am all things to everyone. To the Jews, I'm a Jew, and to the Gentiles, I'm a Gentile. And this is one way that we can be like Paul, and ultimately be more like Jesus.
All right.
And with that, let's close with a word of prayer. We thank you, God, for this wonderful world that you have made. I thank you for its life and vibrance. It's full of color and sounds. You give us work and you give us rest. And I thank you, God, for all the people that live here, all of our different cultures and our expectations, our hopes and dreams, and our fears and our pains as well. I thank you, Lord, that you have sent your Spirit to further your kingdom, to the kingdom of Jesus. And I pray, Lord, that you'll continue to fill us with wisdom and love, faith and hope, so that we can be servants of your grace. Lord, I thank you for people who dedicate their lives to their work and who dedicate their lives to their community. I pray that you'll bless them, that they will be able to provide good fruit in their world, whether as farmers or as parents, as citizens or as entrepreneurs. Whatever they're doing, Lord, may they do it for your glory. And so we pray as you have taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Until next time, brothers and sisters, the grace and peace of Christ be with you all.